Twins were offered in exchange for a bottle of whiskey, so a sober cowboy paid just to return them to their mother. The amber liquid caught the dying sunlight streaming through the grimy windows of Murphy's saloon, casting golden shadows across weathered faces and worn wooden tables. But it wasn't the whiskey that made Samuel Mackenzie's blood run cold that October evening in Copper Ridge, Arizona. It was the desperate words that cut through the smoky air like a blade. "I'll trade you these two for that bottle right there." Sam's calloused hand froze halfway to his cup of coffee, the only drink he'd touched in 3 years. At a corner table, Thomas Garrett sat slumped over, his trembling finger pointing at his 8-year-old twins, Emma and James, who stood frozen by the saloon's entrance like two frightened deer. The children's eyes were wide with terror and confusion. Emma's small hand clutched her brother's sleeve so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Their clothes, once perhaps respectable, now hung in tatters, stained with dust and God knows what else. The boy, James, tried to stand tall and protective in front of his sister, but his thin frame shook with each labored breath. "You drunk, Garrett?" Murphy, the saloon keeper, let out a nervous laugh that died quickly when he saw the man's hollow, desperate eyes. "That ain't funny. Do I look like I'm joking?" Thomas's voice cracked, his hands shaking as he reached for the bottle of whiskey sitting on Murphy's bar. "Jake Morrison's coming for his money tomorrow morning. $40, or—" He swallowed hard. Unable to finish the sentence, everyone in that room understood. Sam had heard the stories. Jake Morrison wasn't the kind of man who accepted late payments. In a town where the copper mines had closed one by one, leaving families destitute and desperate, Morrison had built his empire on other people's misery. Gambling debts, loans with impossible interest rates, and when people couldn't pay, he took everything. Sometimes more than everything. "Thomas, think about what you're saying." Sam's voice was quiet, but carried across the saloon like thunder. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward the lone figure in the corner, the mysterious cowboy who'd drifted into town 6 months ago and never caused trouble, never drank, never even spoke unless spoken to. "Stay out of this, Mackenzie," Thomas snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. "You don't understand. My Mary," his voice broke. "She's been in that hospital in Phoenix for 2 months now. The doctors say she might never walk again after that mining accident. And I've got nothing left. Nothing." The twins pressed closer together at the mention of their mother. Emma's silent tears began to fall, tracing clean lines down her dust-covered cheeks. James wrapped his thin arm around her shoulders, trying to be the man his father had failed to become. Sam studied Thomas Garrett carefully. Once, this man had been the mine foreman, respected and feared in equal measure. His family had lived in the big house on Cedar Street, and his children had worn proper shoes to the one-room schoolhouse. But when the copper ran out and the Eastern investors pulled their money, Thomas had fallen harder than most. The bottle became his confessor, the gambling table his false prophet. "How much for the whiskey, Murphy?" Sam asked, standing slowly. His spurs clicked against the wooden floor as he walked toward the bar, each step measured and deliberate. $12, Murphy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The entire saloon held its breath. $12. In a town where most men were lucky to earn 50 cents a day when work could be found, $12 might as well have been 1,200. Sam reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, the weight of it representing weeks of backbreaking work herding cattle for the Anderson Ranch outside town. "I'll take it," Sam said, placing the coins on the bar with a sound that echoed like gunshots in the silence. "What are you doing?" Thomas looked confused, almost disappointed. Perhaps he'd hoped someone would stop him, give him an excuse to back down from this devil's bargain. Sam picked up the bottle, feeling its weight, remembering another time, another place, when liquid courage had cost him everything that mattered. "I'm buying your children, Thomas. But not for the reasons you think." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Emma let out a small whimper, and James pulled her closer, both children now staring at this stranger who had just purchased their lives with the same casual tone one might use to buy a horse. "You can't just," Murphy started to protest. "Can't what?" Sam turned to face the room, and for the first time, people saw something dangerous in his pale blue eyes, something that suggested this quiet cowboy had seen more than his share of darkness. "A man just offered to sell his children for whiskey, and you're worried about my intentions?" Thomas Garrett stared at the money on the bar, then at his children, then back at the money. The weight of his choice crashed down on him like a collapsing mine shaft. I didn't mean. Yes, you did. Sam's voice cut through the man's protests. You meant every word, and now you have to live with it. Sam walked over to the twins, kneeling down so his eyes were level with theirs. Up close, he could see they were malnourished, their skin pale and their eyes sunken. Emma had a bruise on her cheek that looked suspiciously like the shape of a man's hand. My name is Sam, he said gently. I know you're scared, but I'm not going to hurt you. Do you understand? James found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Are you really taking us away from Papa? Sam glanced back at Thomas, who was now hunched over the bar, his head in his hands, the coins scattered before him like pieces of his broken soul. Your Papa made his choice. Now I've made mine. Where are you taking us? Emma asked, her voice small and fragile. Sam stood, his decision crystallizing in his mind like morning frost. To your mother. The gasps that followed his words told him everything he needed to know. Nobody in this godforsaken town had expected that answer. You don't understand. Thomas looked up, tears streaming down his face. She's in Phoenix. That's 3 days' ride through Apache country. I don't even know if she's still. He couldn't finish the sentence. Then we better get started. Sam extended his hands to the children. Come on. We've got a long journey ahead of us. As the twins hesitantly took his hands, their small fingers cold and trembling in his weathered palms, Sam made a silent promise to himself and to the ghosts of his own past. These children would not suffer for their father's weakness. They would not become casualties of a man's addiction, the way his own family had. The saloon door swung shut behind them as they stepped into the desert evening, leaving Thomas Garrett alone with his $12 and the weight of what he'd done. The last thing Sam heard was the sound of glass breaking as the whiskey bottle hit the floor, followed by the broken sobs of a man who had just discovered there were some things that couldn't be drowned in alcohol. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the vast Arizona sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Sam looked down at Emma and James, two small lives now entirely in his hands, and wondered if he was strong enough to keep the promise he'd just made. The journey to Phoenix would test more than just his resolve. It would test whether a man could truly outrun his past, and whether redemption was possible even in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier. As they walked toward the stable where Sam kept his horse, Emma looked up at him with eyes far too old for her 8 years. Mr. Sam, she whispered, do you think Mama will remember us? The question hit him harder than any punch he'd ever taken. How do you tell a child that mothers never forget, even when everything else in the world seems determined to make them disappear? She'll remember, he said, hoping it was true. And we're going to make sure she gets the chance to prove it. Behind them, Copper Ridge settled into another night of despair and broken dreams. Ahead lay the unknown dangers of the desert, the uncertainty of what they'd find in Phoenix, and the weight of a promise that could either save 3 lives or destroy them all. But for the first time in 3 years, Sam Mackenzie felt something he'd almost forgotten existed: hope. The desert stretched before them like an ocean of sand and broken promises, painted silver by the full moon that hung overhead like a watchful eye. Sam's horse, a sturdy bay mare named Charity, carried the 3 of them through the night with patient determination, her hooves finding purchase on the rocky trail that wound between towering saguaro cacti and jagged mesa formations. Emma had fallen asleep against Sam's chest, her small body finally surrendering to exhaustion after hours of silent tears. James rode behind him, his thin arms wrapped around Sam's waist, fighting sleep with the stubborn determination of a child who'd learned too early that the world could change in terrible ways when you weren't watching. Mr. Sam. James's voice was barely audible over the rhythmic sound of Charity's hooves on stone. Yes, son. Why didn't you keep the whiskey? The question caught Sam off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Children saw things adults missed, noticed the important details that grown folks try to hide. Sam was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. Because I know what that devil's brew can do to a man, he said finally. It took everything from me once. Everything that mattered. Like what? Sam felt the boy's grip tighten around his waist, and he realized that James needed this conversation as much as he needed to have it. Maybe more. I had a wife once, Sarah, and a little girl about your age named Lucy. The words came out rougher than Sam intended, scraped raw by 3 years of trying not to say them out loud. I was working cattle drives back then, gone for months at a time. When I'd come home, I'd drink to celebrate. Then I'd drink when things went bad. Then I'd drink just to drink. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. Sam pulled his coat tighter around Emma, who stirred but didn't wake. What happened to them? James asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be a happy one. Fire, Sam said simply. I was supposed to be watching Lucy while Sarah went to town. But I'd been drinking, and I fell asleep. Knocked over a lantern. He paused, the memory still as sharp as the day it happened. They got trapped upstairs. I tried to get to them, but... He touched the scar that ran along his left forearm, a permanent reminder of his failed attempt at heroism. James was quiet for so long that Sam thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, in a voice smaller than a whisper, the boy said, Papa started drinking after the accident. Mama got hurt when the mine shaft collapsed, and Papa said it was his fault for not checking the supports proper. That's when the drinking got bad. Men do that sometimes, Sam said. We think we can drown our guilt in a bottle. But all we're really doing is drowning ourselves. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the miles passed beneath Charity's steady hooves. Sam found himself scanning the horizon constantly, watching for the telltale signs of trouble that could end their journey before it truly began. Apache raiders had been active in this region, and desperate men sometimes preyed on travelers foolish enough to venture into the desert alone. As dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, they crested a rise and saw smoke in the distance. Not the thin, straight column of a cooking fire, but the thick, black smoke that spoke of destruction and violence. Stay close, Sam murmured, spurring Charity toward the source of the smoke. As they drew nearer, the devastation became clear. A small ranch house sat in ruins, its roof collapsed and walls blackened by flames. The barn was nothing more than charred timber, and scattered around the property were the bodies of cattle, their carcasses already drawing buzzards. Don't look, Sam told the children, but James had already seen too much. His face had gone pale, and his grip on Sam's waist tightened until it was almost painful. Among the ruins, Sam spotted movement. A figure emerged from behind the collapsed barn, walking with a pronounced limp. As they got closer, Sam could see it was an elderly Mexican man, his clothes torn and bloody, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. Senor, the man called out in accented English, you must not stay here. Los Apaches, they may return. Sam dismounted carefully, helping Emma and James down before approaching the injured man. What happened here? My name is Miguel Santos. This was my ranch. The old man's eyes were filled with a pain that went beyond physical injury. They came in the night, took my horses, my cattle, killed my dogs. His voice broke. My grandson, Eduardo, he tried to fight them. Only 16 years old, but he tried to be a man. Sam didn't need to ask what had happened to the boy. The answer was written in the old man's tears and the fresh mound of earth beside the burned-out house. We're heading to Phoenix, Sam said. You need a doctor. Miguel shook his head. It's too dangerous. The Apache war party. They are moving toward the main road. You have children with you. You should go back. But Sam looked at Emma and James, saw the way they were staring at the destruction around them, and knew he couldn't turn back. These children had already lost too much. He wouldn't let them lose their mother too, not while he still drew breath. Is there another way? He asked. Miguel considered this, his weathered face creased in concentration. See, there is an old mining road. Very dangerous, very rough. It goes through Devil's Canyon. Most people, they will not use it. But it leads to Phoenix? Eventually, see. But senor, that canyon, it has a reputation. Bad things happen there. The miners, they used to say it was cursed. Sam helped Miguel onto Charity's back, then lifted Emma and James up behind him. The old man was right about the danger, but Sam had learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous path was the only one that led where you needed to go. The mining road was little more than a goat track carved into the mountainside, winding through narrow passages between towering rock walls that seemed to press in from both sides. The sun, now high overhead, turned the canyon into a furnace, and water became more precious than gold. It was Emma who first noticed something was wrong. She'd been unusually quiet since leaving the burned ranch, But now she tugged on Sam's sleeve and pointed toward a ledge high above them. "There's someone up there," she whispered. Sam followed her gaze and felt his blood turn to ice. Silhouetted against the sky was the figure of an Apache warrior, watching their progress with the patience of a predator. As Sam looked more carefully, he spotted others, positioned at strategic points along the canyon walls. "Miguel," he said quietly, "I thought you said they were heading toward the main road." The old man's face had gone ashen. "They were, unless—" He paused, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Unless they knew about this road. Unless they have been waiting." It was then that Sam realized the truth. This wasn't a chance encounter. The Apache hadn't randomly attacked Miguel's ranch. They'd been herding travelers toward this canyon, using fear to drive them into a trap. And Sam, in his determination to protect the children, had led them straight into it. The attack, when it came, was swift and coordinated. Arrows whistled down from above, one passing so close to Sam's head that he felt the fletching brush his hat. He spurred Charity forward, racing through the narrow canyon as rocks and arrows rained down around them. Emma screamed, and James pressed his face against Sam's back, too terrified to look. Miguel, despite his injuries, held on grimly, his good arm wrapped around James's waist to keep the boy from falling. They burst out of the canyon into a wider valley, Charity's flanks heaving with exhaustion. Behind them, Sam could hear the war cries of their pursuers, growing closer with each passing second. Ahead lay open desert, offering no shelter, no protection. That's when Sam saw the impossible sight that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Rising from the heat shimmer of the desert floor was a dust cloud, and within that cloud, the unmistakable silhouette of a cavalry column. "Soldiers," Miguel breathed, hardly daring to believe it. The cavalry patrol, 20 men strong and led by a grizzled sergeant with skin like leather, intercepted them just as the Apache war party emerged from the canyon. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Faced with disciplined rifle fire from trained soldiers, the Apache warriors melted back into the rocks like shadows at sunrise. "You folks have any idea how lucky you are?" the sergeant asked as his men formed a protective circle around the small group of survivors. "We've been tracking that war party for 3 days. If we'd been 10 minutes later—" Sam didn't need him to finish the sentence. They all knew how close they'd come to joining Eduardo Santos in whatever afterlife awaited those who died violently in the desert. The soldiers escorted them to Phoenix, a journey that took another day and a half through terrain that gradually gave way to civilization. When they finally crested the hill overlooking the territorial capital, Sam felt a mixture of relief and apprehension that threatened to overwhelm him. Phoenix in 1884 was a rough frontier town trying to become something more. The streets were wide but dusty, lined with a mixture of adobe buildings and wooden structures that spoke of rapid, unplanned growth. The hospital sat on the edge of town, a 2-story brick building that looked solid and permanent in a way that most frontier architecture did not. Inside, the smell of carbolic acid and human suffering hung heavy in the air. Sam approached the front desk with Emma and James flanking him like small, nervous guards. "I'm looking for Mary Garrett," he told the nurse, a stern-looking woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. "These are her children." The nurse looked down at Emma and James with surprise, then suspicion. "Mrs. Garrett hasn't had any visitors since she arrived. Her husband said the children were staying with relatives." "Their father lied," Sam said simply. "Can we see her?" The nurse studied them for a long moment, taking in their travel-stained clothes and exhausted faces. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she nodded and led them down a long corridor lined with doors. "Room 12, she said quietly. "But I should warn you, Mrs. Garrett has been difficult since the accident. She's convinced something terrible has happened to her children. The doctors think it might be brain damage from the injury." Sam knocked softly on the door, then pushed it open. The woman lying in the hospital bed was thin almost to the point of being skeletal, her auburn hair spread across the pillow like spilled copper. Her eyes, when they opened, were the same startling blue as her daughter's. "Mary," Sam said gently, "I've brought someone to see you." Emma stepped forward first, her small voice breaking as she whispered, "Mama?" The change in Mary Garrett was instantaneous and miraculous. The vacant, haunted look vanished from her eyes, replaced by a joy so pure and overwhelming that it took Sam's breath away. She struggled to sit up, reaching out with trembling hands toward her children. Emma? James. Oh my God. Oh my babies, I thought you were dead. Thomas told me you'd been taken by fever, that I'd been unconscious for weeks, and she dissolved into tears, pulling her children against her chest, as if she could somehow absorb them back into herself. It was then that Sam understood the full extent of Thomas Garrett's betrayal. Not only had he been prepared to sell his children for whiskey, but he'd told his injured wife that they were dead, allowing her to suffer that unbearable grief while she fought to recover from her own injuries. Who are you? Mary asked, looking at Sam through her tears. How did you find them? Where have they been? Sam sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed, suddenly feeling every one of his 38 years. Ma'am, that's a story that's going to be hard to hear. But these children deserve to have their mother know the truth. He told her everything. The saloon, the desperate bargain, the journey through Apache country, and the man who had been willing to trade his children's lives for $12 worth of whiskey. With each word, Mary's face grew paler, her hands tightening protectively around Emma and James. When Sam finished, the room was silent except for the sound of quiet weeping. But it wasn't Mary who was crying. It was James, finally allowing himself to grieve for the father he'd lost long before Sam had ever entered that saloon. Will you press charges? Sam asked quietly. Against Thomas, I mean. Mary looked down at her children, seeing them for the first time since they'd entered the room. She noticed Emma's bruised cheek, James's too thin frame, the way they both seemed to flinch at sudden movements or loud sounds. No, she said finally. Thomas is already living with the worst punishment imaginable. He's lost his children, and he knows it's his own fault. Prison couldn't hurt him worse than that knowledge will. Sam stood to leave, feeling like an intruder in this moment of family reunion. But Emma's voice stopped him at the door. Mr. Sam, where are you going? He turned back, seeing three faces looking at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. I figure my job was done. You're back with your mama now. Your job. Mary's voice was sharp with emotion. Sir, you saved my children's lives. You brought them back to me when everyone said they were dead. That's not a job, that's. She paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. That's a miracle. Sam shifted uncomfortably and used to such praise. I just did what needed doing. The nurse tells me you've been paying for my medical bills, Mary continued. Money you couldn't afford, for a woman you'd never met. What? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Sam looked at Emma and James, saw something of his own lost daughter in their faces, and realized that some debts could never be fully repaid, only passed forward. Because I owed a debt, he said simply. And sometimes, the only way to pay what you owe is to help someone else. 3 months later, Sam McKenzie stood on the front porch of a small house on the outskirts of Phoenix, watching Emma and James chase chickens around the dusty yard. Mary had recovered enough to walk with the aid of a cane, and while she would never be quite the same as before the accident, she was alive and whole and surrounded by the children who had been returned to her by a sober cowboy and $12 worth of grace. Thomas Garrett had disappeared one night from Copper Ridge, leaving behind only empty bottles and the memory of a man who had lost everything that mattered. Some said he'd headed east, back to whatever life he'd left behind when he came west seeking fortune in the copper mines. Others whispered that he'd been found in the desert, another victim of the unforgiving frontier. Sam hoped, for the children's sake, that Thomas had found some form of redemption somewhere, but he suspected that some wounds were too deep to ever fully heal. As for Sam himself, he'd discovered something he hadn't dared to hope for in 3 years of wandering. He'd found a purpose beyond simply surviving each day, a reason to believe that the future might hold something more than endless atonement for past sins. Uncle Sam, Emma called out, using the name she'd given him despite his protests. Mama says supper's ready. Sam smiled, a genuine expression that had become less rare in recent weeks. He looked up at the evening sky, painted in shades of gold and purple that seemed to promise better tomorrows, and whispered a prayer of thanks to whatever force had guided him into that saloon on that October evening when a desperate man had offered his children for a bottle of whiskey. Some debts, Sam had learned, could only be repaid by choosing to be better than the worst thing you'd ever done. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got the chance to save more than just someone else's life in the process. The desert wind carried the sound of children's laughter across the valley, and for the first time in years, Sam Mackenzie felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. He felt like he was home.